Imagine a world where intelligence isn't about degrees or titles, but about common sense.
Mhm.
Now imagine Washington failing every single test.
Why do the smartest people in power make the dumbest decisions?
John Kennedy's book doesn't just ask that question. It exposes the truth behind America's most contagious epidemic: stupidity in leadership.
Brace yourself. This isn't politics as usual. This is a test Washington will never pass.
Hello, everyone. Hi, all.
And welcome to Book Podcast Zone.
I'm John, and with me is Emma.
It's really great to be digging into this material with you. We are launching into a pretty deep, sharp examination of the political landscape today. And our guide, well, it's Senator John Kennedy's, frankly, eye-opening perspective in his book, How to Test Negative for Stupid, and Why Washington Never Will.
Yeah, this book really hits differently, doesn't it? It is so far from, your standard dense, dry policy brief.
Absolutely.
The tone he strikes, it perfectly blends serious political critique with, well, genuine approachable language, plain talk. And crucially, he uses humor almost like a scalpel, To dissect the absurdity, Kennedy's really demanding a return to just everyday smarts.
That common sense thing.
Exactly, the kind of sense we all use to, navigate traffic or manage a household budget. But he's applying it to a system that seems, frankly, deliberately set up to stifle it.
It does feel that way sometimes. So our mission today, really for you, the listener, is to give you the ultimate shortcut through this. We're not just going to summarize. We plan to really unpack the core ideas from the first 3 chapters. We need to identify the observable symptoms of this political stupidity he talks about.
Right.
Then understand the long and honestly pretty depressing history of how it just keeps recurring in D.C.
Yeah.
And finally, we need to hear those personal human stories, the ones from the Senate floor that kind of reveal the chaos behind the, carefully constructed political curtain.
We really want you to walk away from this deep dive feeling, well, not just informed, but actually capable of diagnosing the problem yourself. So when you read that next headline about some, ill-conceived policy or maybe a spectacular infrastructure failure.
It seems to happen a lot lately.
It does. You'll have Kennedy's framework to figure out, was that a calculated risk that just, went sideways? Or was it actually a predictable outcome? Something that happened because they ignored simple, really evident warnings.
That's the key distinction.
So let's jump right into that diagnosis.
Yeah.
Chapter 1. Identifying the symptoms of stupid in politics.
Yeah.
I increase. Core argument. The snowball effect.
Okay, so Kennedy pulls you in immediately. And not with some, heavy philosophical treatise, but by focusing on what seem like small, manageable flaws. The core argument right here in Chapter 1 is what he calls the snowball effect.
The snowball effect, right.
Exactly. It's how these simple oversights, things that get ignored, maybe because of convenience or short-term political calculation, they don't just stay simple. They metastasize. Or, like Kennedy puts it, they snowball into these major, systemic, and sometimes utterly catastrophic failures.
It's like the bureaucratic version of seeing a crack in your foundation and just throwing a rug over it.
Good analogy.
You know it's there.
Yeah.
You absolutely know it's going to be a problem eventually. But the immediate hassle of fixing it, the budget fight, having to admit publicly you messed up, the project delays.
All that political pain.
Right. That immediate pain is judged as a greater cost than the perceived risk of the whole thing collapsing, maybe, on your watch. And Kennedy really emphasizes the avoidable nature of these things. These aren't acts of God. They're avoidable catastrophes.
And let's unpack the political calculus behind that denial, because it's crucial. It's not necessarily that the leaders themselves are stupid or even uninformed a lot of the time.
Right. They're often very smart people.
Exactly. It's that the system itself incentivizes denial. Think about it. The political cost of admitting some technical flaw or a budget overrun today, that cost is immediate. It's measurable.
Yeah, facing the press conference, the attacks from the other side.
Losing momentum on your big project.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But the cost of the future, catastrophic failure, well, that's distant. It's abstract. And, crucially, it'll probably fall on the watch of the next guy, the next administration.
So they're basically trading long-term public disaster for short-term political safety.
That's the trade-off, yeah.
Okay, so let's make this concrete. Kennedy uses examples, and we should too. Let's talk about that City Grail, a commuter rail expansion crisis. That thing that just dominated the news in late 2025.
Oh yeah, that was a mess. A multi-billion-dollar project, right? Supposed to ease traffic across the whole metro area.
Supposed to. The first phase got delayed by, 18 months? Ended up costing billions in overruns, and then the literal collapse, a major infrastructure failure.
But if you trace it back, like Kennedy encourages you to do, you see those clear, ignored red flags right at the beginning.
Tell us about those flags.
Well, the initial engineering reports, the very first ones they flagged, serious soil instability, particularly in two key tunnel segments that were planned to go near an old, filled-in riverbed. Not exactly stable ground.
Okay, so unstable ground. What was the fix?
The engineers suggested a specific design change, a pretty expensive shoring process. It would have added maybe 3 months to the timeline and about, let's say, 5% to the total budget. Not insignificant, but manageable.
The politicians. They were desperate for that ribbon cutting, weren't they? It was a huge part of the upcoming mayor's re-election platform, getting transit moving.
Exactly. So those engineering warnings, they weren't seen as crucial safety data. They were seen as a nuisance, an obstacle to the political timeline.
So what happened? Did they just ignore the engineers?
Worse, instead of adopting the safer design, the main contractor feeling immense political pressure, stay on schedule, stay on budget, they quietly submitted revised engineering reports that, well, conveniently minimize the instability risks.
Ah, the magic paperwork fix.
Precisely. And the local and state leaders, seeing the, corrected paperwork all stamped and approved, they could then plausibly claim they did their due diligence. They ignored those initial dissent memos from the first engineers and pushed ahead with the original, faster, cheaper plan.
And there's your snowball starting to roll downhill.
It was absolutely rolling. Fast forward to when they were actually digging, doing the foundational work. Boom. One of those key tunnel segments completely collapses.
Disaster.
Total disaster. Not only destroying billions in completed work and triggering years, literally years of delay, but it actually destabilized nearby commercial buildings too.
Oh, wow.
And the subsequent investigations, they uncovered the whole fraudulent reporting chain, and it all stemmed back to that first simple oversight about the soil stability and the political pressure to just look the other way.
The real tragedy, and this is what Kennedy hammers home, is that the entire catastrophe, the risk, the specific location, the likely outcome, that you basically detailed in an internal memo 2 years before the collapse even happened.
Avoidable. Completely avoidable.
And that leads right to that emotional turning point Kennedy talked about in the chapter. It's when the everyday frustrations, the delays, the cost overruns, suddenly hit home in a massive way. The public anger isn't just about a tunnel collapsing.
No, it's deeper.
It's the realization, that sort of sickening feeling that this monumental screw-up was utterly predictable and preventable. It makes you incredibly cynical, doesn't it? But Kennedy uses that very frustration as the fuel for his critique.
Yeah, he taps into that shared "are you kidding me" feeling. So the core symptom of stupidity in leadership, as he defines it here, it's prioritizing the appearance of success. The optics, the positive headline, the ribbon-cutting photo op over the actual reality of sound engineering or sound finance or sound policy.
Appearance over substance. Every time. 2, the diagnosis moment.
Okay, that sets up perfectly what Kennedy calls the diagnosis moment. This is where his critique imagines that point in the process, that fork in the road, where just a little bit of common sense intervention, maybe a simple, skeptical question from an outsider, could have saved the whole day, could have reversed the snowball's trajectory. Right, it's the if-only moment. Exactly. It's applying the if-only they had just audit to the situation. So going back to the city, a rail failure. If only the mayor had just insisted on calling in a third-party, completely non-politically connected engineering firm to independently review that initial dissent memo.
The one that flagged the soil instability.
Right. The whole project, billions of dollars, years of chaos, could potentially have been saved. Common sense acts like the auditor in this scenario. It spots the glaring contradiction, the thing that just doesn't add up.
And we see these denial patterns showing up constantly, don't we? Especially in some of the big policy debates we saw unfold through 2025. Let's talk about that major failure involving resource allocation and the big push for an expedited energy transition.
Oh, that's a perfect example, yeah. In this huge effort to rapidly expand a specific new energy sector, the policymakers involved dramatically curtailed a lot of these standard common sense environmental checks, specifically the ones concerning regional water usage limits.
Water usage. In often dry regions, what could go wrong?
Well, the warnings were explicit. They were widely published. You had multiple climate models, hydrological studies, all predicting that the regional drought conditions meant the proposed industrial water consumption rate was, well, fundamentally unsustainable long term.
But the policy went through anyway.
It did. It was driven by this really powerful narrative about, national security, energy independence, immediate job creation in that sector. Very appealing politically.
It's the classic short-sighted boom scenario, isn't it? They achieved their short-term goal, right? They boosted domestic energy production in that sector by, 20%? The headlines were glowing for a while.
Absolutely glowing, mission accomplished on the energy front. But then within 6 months, the predictable happened. Regional water tables just plummeted. It forced massive emergency irrigation cutbacks across the board.
Which hits?
Agriculture, the absolute foundation of the local economy in that region, it basically collapsed, which then led to widespread food inflation, ripple effects, social crisis, protests in the state capital, the whole 9 yards.
So the diagnosis moment there, it seems blindingly obvious in hindsight.
It was clear to anyone not completely buried in the policy jargon at the time. The common sense intervention should have been simple. You cannot possibly run a massive water-intensive industrial operation in a known drought-prone region without first guaranteeing the survival of the pre-existing essential industry, in this case, agriculture.
That's not complex climate science we're talking about. That's just elementary resource management 101.
Exactly. But the policymakers, they got so wrapped up in the political complexity and the grand narrative of the energy transition that they completely missed the simple elementary connection. No water, no food, no long-term economy. Period.
This is how Kennedy really connects it back to the listener, back to you. These political symptoms, these patterns of denial and short-term thinking, they mirror bad decisions we see everywhere, don't they?
All the time.
Think about a business that goes under because the management just ignored their own low-level employees, warning them about a critical security flaw in a new software product.
Right, because patching the flaw now seemed too expensive or too slow compared to the potential risk of a data breach later.
Or even just in personal finance, ignoring the simple common sense advice to pay down that credit card with the 25% APR because you wanted the immediate buzz of buying something frivolous today.
It's the same pattern, delaying the necessary pain for immediate gratification, even when you know the long-term consequences will be worse.
So the real actionable takeaway from Chapter 1 is getting better at recognizing these patterns. The patterns of denial, the patterns of short-termism. Common sense lets you audit the contradictions. If a policy promises, say, endless growth while completely ignoring fundamental resource limits,
Ding, ding.
You've likely spotted a symptom of what Kennedy calls structured stupidity.
Well put.
Okay, that really wraps up our deep dive into this critical first chapter. The warning signs, as Kennedy shows, are just everywhere, if you know where and how to look. We've really dug into how simple oversight snowball and the often devastating cost of just ignoring basic common sense.
Yeah, the foundation is laid. Required call to action 1.
So if you're finding this deep dive insightful, especially our detailed look at how the snowball effect plays out in real policy, kindly remember to like, subscribe, and share this so we can keep bringing you more updates. We're about to take a trip through history next to see just how long Washington has actually been failing this common sense test, and maybe why it keeps repeating the very same mistakes.
It's quite a history lesson. Core argument, cycles of blunder and repetition. Right, so in Chapter 2, Kennedy doesn't let you off the hook. He doesn't give the reader the comfort of thinking, oh, today's mistakes are somehow unique or worse than before. No. He pulls back the curtain on history, and what he establishes is this really frustrating, almost cyclical theme.
Yes, cyclical is the word.
The fundamental failure in Washington, he argues, is this persistent refusal, maybe inability to actually learn from previous failures. We're not making entirely new mistakes most of the time. We seem to be stuck in these repeating cycles of blunder and, well, repetition.
This is where the narrative tension really starts to build in the book, I found. You read about these historical missteps, policy failures, wars, economic crises, and they echo so perfectly, so precisely in modern times. It just can't be a coincidence. It feels like some kind of institutional amnesia.
It really does. Washington should have the ultimate playbook for how not to do things by now, right? Vietnam, the savings and loan crisis, countless regulatory failures. The lessons are written in bold print. Yet the system seems almost intent on ripping out the pages that contain those crucial lessons.
Or maybe highlighting the wrong parts.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Let's ground this in a specific critical concept that Kennedy implicitly critiques again and again in his historical discussion. regulatory capture.
Okay, define that for us quickly.
Sure. So for you listening, regulatory capture is basically the phenomenon where the government agency, the one that was set up to act in the public interest, oversee an industry, instead ends up advancing the commercial or maybe the political concerns of the very special interest groups it's supposed to be regulating. The watchdog becomes the lapdog.
Got it. The regulator gets captured by the regulated.
Exactly. And we saw clear signs of this back in the 1970s. Think about major infrastructure projects, big environmental decisions, construction lobbying groups, energy companies. They often succeeded back then in manipulating safety standards or maybe minimizing the cost estimates for environmental cleanup or mitigation.
What was the result?
Well, predictably, failed dams, collapsing bridges, unexpected ecological damage, and often massive public bailouts to fix the mess. The lesson learned then seemed crystal clear. Independent oversight needs to be robust. It needs to be structurally separated from the industry it's supposed to regulate. You can't have the fox guarding the hen house.
Seems obvious.
Yeah.
But history repeated itself, didn't it? Kennedy stresses that the cycle isn't just repeating. Sometimes it feels like it's accelerating.
It does. Look at the financial instability crisis that really blew up in the mid-2020s. Much of that was directly linked to the earlier deregulation of a key, quite complex subsector of the financial industry.
Right. I remember the arguments.
The industry lobbied incredibly aggressively. They argued with great political sophistication, mind you, that the existing regulations were stifling innovation, they were creating an unfair global disadvantage, all the usual buzzwords.
And Washington bought it.
Hook, line, and sinker. They achieved almost total capture of the regulatory body that was meant to oversee them. They secured massive loopholes in the rules. So that historical misstep, allowing powerful industry influence to essentially trump public safety and long-term financial stability, directly set the stage for the headaches and crises of the mid-2020s.
The tension is almost unbearable when you realize these lessons were written down, debated, and supposedly learned from policy failures decades ago.
Yeah.
Yet we seemingly chose collective amnesia because the short-term political convenience of deregulation, or of looking the other way, was just too tempting for those in power at the time.
It's more than just watching a bad movie plot repeat itself. It feels like a tragedy where the main characters deliberately refuse to read the script that clearly contains their own downfall. Kennedy sort of suggests that every generation of politicians falls prey to this hubris, this belief that their specific modern context is somehow unique, that they are smart enough to escape the predictable consequences of, say, centralized power or unchecked special interest influence that brought down previous generations.
This time it's different.
The four most expensive words in the English language, right?
Yeah.
2, missed opportunities and political shifts.
The real emotional turning point in this chapter, I think, for the reader is that profound sense of missed opportunities. Just imagine if those historical lessons, say, about regulatory capture or the dangers of interventionism, had been truly absorbed. If we hadn't allowed the regulatory framework to get eroded again in the early 2000s, we had actually established structural protections against these cyclical failures.
Yeah.
Imagine the resources, the stability, the public trust we might have today.
It evokes that really frustrating mix of anger at the past, combined with this faint, maybe naive hope that this time, maybe this crisis will finally be the one that breaks the cycle.
Kennedy's focus here is sharp. Historical missteps, they don't just fade away into history books. They actively shape today's government structure. They shape today's decision-making processes.
Absolutely. The incredible complexity of the current federal budget process, for instance, the endless layers of bureaucratic sign-offs needed for almost anything, the very way Congress organizes its committees and jurisdictions, all of these things are, in a way, like monuments built to commemorate old, forgotten failures.
Designed to prevent the last disaster.
Exactly. But often structurally incapable of preventing the next one because the nature of the threat changes.
Okay, we have to bring in some context here from recent 2025 political shifts that seem to visibly mirror these old toxic patterns Kennedy describes. What comes to mind?
Well, the most obvious one is the ongoing, just debilitating gridlock we've seen in Congress, particularly over the annual budget resolution. That fight has plagued us this past year, hasn't it? We're watching the inability to pass even basic, legally mandated spending measures. Why? Because of these deeply entrenched partisan demands.
And often those demands are symbolic rather than substantive, right?
Yeah.
They hinge on completely non-budgetary ideological points being tacked onto must-pass bills.
Precisely. And this political phenomenon, it's almost eerily identical to the infamous government shutdowns and legislative battles we saw back in the mid-1990s. Specifically, you remember the budget showdowns of 1995 and
Oh,
1996?
vividly. Newt Gingrich versus Bill Clinton. It paralyzed everything.
The core mechanism is exactly the same today. One party, or even a faction within a party, refuses to fund the essential functions of the government unless the opposing side concedes on some specific, often unrelated social or ideological issue. It's using the basic functioning of government as leverage for partisan goals.
So we really are on a time travel adventure in legislative futility. The historical assumption back then, maybe, was that certain legislative norms, the unwritten rules of compromise, of functional responsibility, would hold the line, that people wouldn't actually shut down the government over these things repeatedly.
But the modern reality, as we're seeing in 2025, is that basic function is routinely sacrificed for political posturing, for symbolic wins that energize the base, even if they harm the country overall.
And the tragedy here, as Kennedy would likely point out, is that the procedural reforms that could have protected basic government function from this kind of partisan hostage-taking, things like automatic continuing resolutions to prevent shutdowns, or stricter limits on unrelated ideological riders on appropriations bills.
Those reforms were never fully cemented, were they? Because implementing them would have limited the power, the leverage of the very politicians who actually benefit from the potential for gridlock and shutdown threats.
Wow. So those historical missteps, those failures to reform the process after the 90s crises, they didn't just fade, they actually hardened the structures of gridlock, didn't they?
They did. They made the political stupidity of 2025, the shutdowns, the brinksmanship, feel like a logical, almost structural extension of the failures of the past. The system, in some ways, is optimized for this repetition, and the failure to learn, or perhaps the refusal to implement the lessons from history, seems to guarantee this chronic dysfunction.
It really does seem like Washington either have a terrible collective memory or, maybe more cynically as you suggested, a vested interest in forgetting the past because the broken procedures, the ones built around those historical failures, actually benefit the current power structure and negotiating tactics.
It's a bleak thought, but it aligns with Kennedy's critique.
Okay, now that we've firmly established the historical context for this recurring stupidity, let's take a quick pause right there. Required call to action 2?
And if you appreciate us connecting these dots, for you linking those historical blunders directly to the political headaches we're facing today, and hopefully providing you with a clearer analytical framework, please do take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this deep dive. Your support is what ensures we can continue to bring you this level of detailed, insightful analysis. Up next, we're going inside the Senate itself to hear from the man himself with intimate stories from the floor.
Yeah, this next chapter is fascinating. A core argument. Humanizing the chaos. All right, chapter 3. For me, this is really where the book hits its emotional and maybe its intellectual high point. Kennedy uses his position, his platform, to share these incredibly personal experiences. He draws you, the listener, right into his world with stories that actually humanize the political chaos we've been talking about.
Yeah, this isn't abstract theory anymore. This is the lived day-to-day reality of trying to get something done inside the U.S. Senate.
And it provides that critical perspective that only a real insider can offer, doesn't it? We often view Washington as this, monolith, a cold, abstract machine cranking out budgets and legislation.
Faceless bureaucracy.
But Kennedy reminds us, no, it's run by human beings, people who are often flawed, probably perpetually exhausted, and frequently forced into these absurd, illogical situations simply because of Senate procedure or rigid political demands from back home or from leadership.
He really exposes those internal daily realities that often seem completely absurd from the outside. Situations where basic common sense just clashes violently head-on with Senate rules, traditions, or jurisdictional turf wars.
The emotional peak of this chapter, I felt, is where Kennedy's vulnerability, you can almost feel his sheer exasperation sometimes is coupled with this sharp, cutting humor. It's that shared knowing laugh you have when you recognize that the emperor of bureaucracy truly has no clothes, even when that emperor is wielding immense constitutional power.
And that highlights the really functional importance of the humor Kennedy uses throughout the book. It's not just him trying to be funny, or even just a coping mechanism against the, existential dread of watching supposedly intelligent people make willfully illogical choices day after day.
It serves a purpose.
A critical purpose. Humor acts as a deconstructive tool. If you can make a piece of bureaucratic nonsense or procedural absurdity sound ridiculous, if you can highlight the sheer practical stupidity of it, you expose the flaws that all the complex, obfuscating policy language often tries to mask. Laughter cuts through the jargon.
Okay, this chapter really emphasizes that unique perspective of a sitting senator sharing these internal frustrations. Let's expand on that role-playing idea we touched on earlier. Let's really try to illustrate this frustrating clash between, say, the straightforward needs of the public versus the labyrinthine reality of getting something done on Capitol Hill.
Okay, let's set the scene again. Imagine a Senate committee hearing. The topic is a bill trying to allocate emergency funds for flood insurance reform. This is maybe happening in the aftermath of our fictional city, a rail crisis, which, let's say, also worsened regional flooding issues due to drainage problems caused by the construction failures. So, people need help fast.
Got it. So I'll be the senator focused on common sense, maybe a bit exasperated. You be the voice of Senate procedure, the expert staffer, perhaps.
All right, sounds good. Go ahead, Senator.
Sighs slightly. Mr. Chairman, colleagues, I've just spent the last 2 hours trying to read through the, 400 pages of this emergency amendment. Look, the goal here is simple, isn't it? We need to make sure that folks in disaster-prone areas, like the ones affected by the City A floods, can actually get affordable flood insurance without having to declare bankruptcy first. That's it.
Calmly, perhaps a bit wearily. Senator, the committee understands the urgency, of course.
Then why on God's green earth do we need count 'em, six separate, incredibly dense subclauses defining what constitutes a seasonal inundation event? We could just use the clear, one-sentence legal definition that the insurance industry and FEMA already use. It exists. Why are we reinventing the wheel here and making it square?
Clears throat softly. Well, Senator, with all due respect, that specific definitional language isn't really optional in this legislative context. That level of granularity, that specificity is required. Why? Because Clause 2B of the National Flood Risk Mitigation Act of 1988, which is, as you know, a key piece of controlling legislation, mandates strict adherence to the original definition of inundation event as it was codified back then under Title VII of the U.S. Code.
But that was nearly 40 years ago. The science has changed. The rainfall patterns have changed.
Be that as it may, Senator, to deviate from that established, codified legislative history now would require a separate, extremely complex conforming amendment. And that amendment, unfortunately, would need to be cross-referenced with and approved by the 5 separate committee jurisdictions that have some claim over this issue. Agriculture, because of watershed impacts, Homeland Security, because of FEMA, Commerce, because of insurance regulation, Finance, due to federal liabilities, and banking, also due to insurance and lending implications.
But that level of complication, it means no one on the ground. Not the poor local official trying to implement this, not the insurance adjusters trying to process claims, and certainly not the poor homeowner trying desperately to fill out the forms while their basement is still flooded. No one will understand it. If we just simplify the language using the existing standard, we could pass this bill today. We can ensure help actually goes out this week. We could save maybe 3 weeks of internal committee haggling over definitions.
Pauses briefly. Sir, that argument, while, well, certainly appealing to common sense, would unfortunately set what many here would consider a dangerous precedent. If this committee were to unilaterally ignore the Title VII definition simply for the sake of speed, it could be argued that we are fundamentally eroding the established legislative foundation for how we define federal liability across numerous programs.
So procedure trumps people needing help.
Furthermore, Senator, we would be opening the door to, well, let's just say a certain influential senator from State X. His state's interests, particularly regarding historical agricultural subsidies, rely heavily on maintaining those precise Title VII definitions. He would almost certainly raise a point of order on the floor procedural challenge.
We would do what?
Which would immediately halt consideration of this emergency bill. It would force probably a week of floor debate purely on the procedure of defining inundation, not on the actual policy of helping flood victims. That, Senator, is simply the procedural cost of adhering to nearly 4 decades of legislative history and jurisdictional precedent in this body. Slumps slightly. So, we argue about definitions from 1988 while people's homes are underwater in 2025. That's
the Senate, Senator.
Wow. Okay, that detailed exchange, I think, perfectly captures the kind of absurdity Kennedy describes. The common sense, practical, urgent approach isn't rejected because it's logically a bad idea.
Not at all.
It's rejected because it violates the complex, almost sacred internal machinery of procedure, jurisdictional turf wars, and longstanding tradition. The institutional cost of being smart procedurally outweighs the immediate practical benefit of being smart for the actual American people needing help.
It's prioritizing the process over the outcome. 2, the personal toll and geographical influence.
And Kennedy makes it clear that this constant clash, this banging your head against the procedural wall, takes a major personal toll on the people involved. These anecdotes he shares, they really highlight the sheer exhaustion.
The burnout must be incredible. The ethical compromises that sometimes feel necessary just to get even a fraction of a decent policy passed. And just the enormous cognitive load required to simply navigate this labyrinth day in and day out.
The insight there is really profound, I think. The stupidity that we, the public, often observe from the outside. It isn't always malicious. It's not always intentional obstruction, though sometimes it is. But sometimes, Kennedy suggests, it's simply the result of deeply human exhaustion colliding with these inhuman, almost Byzantine processes.
Yeah, the system itself seems designed to wear down common sense over time. It forces people, even well-intentioned people, to eventually take the path of least procedural resistance.
Right. The path that satisfies all the historical precedents, all the committee chair demands, all the jurisdictional claims, even if that path leads to a policy outcome that is demonstrably less logical or effective for the country.
It's the path that avoids the fight, even if the fight is necessary.
And we also gain really critical context in this chapter through Kennedy's specific Louisiana roots, don't we? His stories are often enriched by this geographic perspective, his background. It provides such a vital counterpoint to the, dominant D.C. or maybe Ivy League intellectual echo chamber.
Absolutely. He comes from a political environment, Louisiana, where arguably straight talk, tangible results, and just practical survival are often valued most more highly than Washington's particular brand of high-minded, often esoteric, and ultimately abstract debate.
That background seems to give him a crucial distance, a healthy skepticism maybe towards Washington dogma. Someone coming from a non-Ivy League background or just a highly practical, regionally diverse place like Louisiana, they might be much quicker to just call something out as, plain dumb.
Yeah, because they haven't been socialized over decades into accepting the traditions and the jargon that justify the illogic. Their default setting is still basic common sense, which just throws the inherent illogic of the Washington machine into even sharper, more painful relief.
It's that constant tension, isn't it? Between the philosopher king who can theorize beautifully about the perfect system and the plumber who actually knows what happens when the pipes get clogged with decades of procedural residue and jurisdictional gunk.
That's a great way to put it.
Kennedy's storytelling sessions, his anecdotes, they rely heavily on highlighting this contrast. They serve to remind us that the flaws in Washington are fundamentally human flaws: ego, exhaustion, stubbornness, short-sightedness. But these flaws get amplified and sometimes even immortalized by the rigid rules and traditions of the institution itself.
Yeah, the personal stories are definitely what stick with you the most. They remind you that even this incredibly powerful institution is ultimately run by flawed, tired human people who often seem trapped by the very systems they're supposed to be controlling. Okay, we'll be right back after a quick break to talk about how the media then tries to spin these stories and why we often end up confused about the real source of the chaos. But first, required call to action 3. We really truly appreciate you joining us on this in-depth analysis today. If you value this comprehensive look we're taking at the symptoms, the history, and the very real human cost of political dysfunction, as outlined by Kennedy, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps others find us, and it ensures you get more updates as we continue our investigation into why Washington never seems to pass that basic common sense test.
We've got more ground to cover. #tag remaining chapters preview. Brief teaser for future episodes.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've really established the symptoms, the deep historical roots, and the human context of the problem Kennedy is diagnosing, it's important to know he doesn't just stop there with the diagnosis. The remaining chapters of the book offer a really profound look at both the external and the internal forces that help perpetuate this stupidity. And importantly, he does eventually offer a potential path towards maybe some remediation.
Right, it's not all doom and gloom. So coming up in our future deep dives, we'll hit Chapter 4, Media and Misinformation. This is where Kennedy really exposes the massive machinery of spin. We'll look closely at how complex policy failures, like the ones we've discussed, get distilled, sometimes twisted, or occasionally just deliberately obscured by various media outlets, leading to widespread public confusion about what actually happened and why.
And the emotional shift there for you, the reader or listener, is hopefully moving from that feeling of just being confused and overwhelmed by the noise to one of feeling a bit more empowered, realizing you can cut through the spin if you understand the political mechanics of obfuscation.
And we'll definitely tie that directly into current 2025 media trends. We have to talk about how the hyperspeed and the inherently polarizing structure of evolving social media platforms have fundamentally changed the speed and the temperature of misinformation, often making the political chaos feel exponentially worse than the underlying policy reality might actually be.
Then in Chapter 5, Bureaucracy Blues, Kennedy draws us into that crushing, soul-destroying grind of endless government red tape. This is where he focuses on how inefficiency, institutional inertia, and sometimes even faulty institutional memory actively stifle innovation and common-sense practical solutions.
Yeah, and we'll discuss some of the current 2025 government reform initiatives that are constantly being promised, to streamline bureaucracy. But we'll analyze why they often fall short, perhaps because they fail to address the core problem Kennedy hints at. Sometimes the bureaucracy isn't just a means to an end. Maintaining the complex bureaucratic process is the political goal itself for certain interests.
But then the narrative shifts, which is important. Chapter 6, Common Sense Remedies. This is where Kennedy really ramps up the energy. He starts offering straightforward, practical fixes. Things that don't necessarily require rewriting the Constitution, just maybe a fundamental change in attitude and approach within the existing system.
Right, he hits an emotional high point here, a sense of optimism, showing how everyday wisdom, that basic common sense we started with, could theoretically be applied to these big, seemingly intractable political problems.
And we'll try to contextualize this with some recent, say, October 2025 policy wins and losses. We'll look for examples where maybe common sense actually managed to sneak past the procedural guards and achieve some genuine positive results, and ask how that happened.
And finally, the book culminates in Chapter 7, Why Washington Won't Change. This is where Kennedy confronts the really hard truths about institutional resistance to reform. It's a poignant turning point, maybe a mix of acceptance about the difficulties, combined with a final, pointed call to action directed squarely at the public.
Yeah, we'll explore those deep-rooted habits. He identifies things like the structural reliance on constant fundraising, the self-selection process that often brings certain types of personalities into politics, and we'll look at ongoing 2025 challenges like the chronic legislative gridlock we discussed that make fundamental change just brutally difficult. It really sets up a reflective finale.
Leaving us with something pretty profound to consider about the nature of power, inertia, and maybe the limits of common sense in such a complex system. #Outrek.
Okay, so to quickly summarize our really extensive deep dive today into just the first 3 chapters of Senator Kennedy's critique. First, we learned how to identify the key symptoms of political stupidity, particularly by recognizing how simple, ignored oversights almost inevitably snowball into major catastrophes.
Right. Then second, we established that Washington often seems trapped in these structural cycles of historical repetition. It continually fails, or maybe refuses, to absorb the critical lessons written in decades of previous policy failures.
And third, maybe most importantly for understanding the dynamics, we appreciated the vital human cost of politics. We saw how inhuman procedures, bureaucratic inertia, and sheer personal exhaustion can wear down common sense, as revealed so powerfully in those intimate, often frustrating anecdotes from the Senate floor.
And gaining this knowledge, understanding this framework from Kennedy especially, the distinction between genuinely complex strategy versus plain avoidable stupidity that's fueled by short-term denial or procedural worship, we think this is absolutely essential for you, the listener, for navigating the political landscape today.
Yeah. So when you next see a major policy failure unfold in the news, you now have a better vocabulary, a better diagnostic toolkit you can ask. Was that a calculated risk that simply failed? Or was it really just another ignored red flag, another snowball that was convenient to let roll downhill?
So we want to leave you with one final provocative thought today, something for you to mull over until our next deep dive, building on these themes. If the history of stupidity in Washington is so clear, as Kennedy lays out, and the personal cost for those involved is so high, what specific entrenched habit, maybe one not explicitly detailed in our discussion today, but certainly alluded to by Kennedy's critique of the Senate's internal culture, what single habit do you believe is the biggest blocker to true common sense reform in Washington?
Is it maybe the obsessive structural reliance on constant fundraising, which shapes priorities and takes up so much time? Could it be the arcane seniority system within Congress, which often rewards long service and loyalty over innovative thinking or subject matter expertise? Or perhaps it's the internal committee structures themselves, the way they're set up, which almost seem designed to incentivize turf wars over genuine cooperation on complex issues.
Think about that one internal, seemingly unshakable rule or habit that, in your view, consistently kills common sense first, before a policy even gets properly debated.
It's a tough question with no easy answer.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material today. We really look forward to continuing this journey with you very